Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I'm doing a standalone review of Uncanny Magazine Issue 24, Disabled People Destroy Science Fiction. I recently read this collection of science fiction short stories and nonfiction essays and thought it was really worthwhile. There are so many different people who contributed to this that I really wanted to make sure I stopped and acknowledged a few different stories and essays and what I thought they had to offer to the conversation about disability representation in science fiction. So first, I want to mention a few of the science fiction short stories that really stood out to me. The first of these is Heavy Lifting by A.T. Greenblatt. This, I think, is such a great example of how there can be a main character with a disability that is definitely a part of them, but it's not the point of the story. The point of the story is the science fiction, the action, the adventure. I thought this story was so funny and so irreverent and just did such a great job of really creating a cool story that happened to have a disabled protagonist. Another story that I thought was really interesting and thought-provoking was The Things I Miss the Most by Nisi Shawl. In this, it really explores the idea of what the downsides of curing someone of their disability could be, and how they might feel less than whole when their disability is taken away from them because that was a defining part of who they were. And I thought that that really made me reflect and think a bit. Another one was A House by the Sea by P.H. Lee. This is a story that is in response to Le Guin's The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. I mentioned this in my wrap-up earlier this past week, so I will link that below. And this is really fascinating because in Le Guin's story, there was this idea that if a child has grown up neglected and abused, there's no real point in trying to let that child have a regular life afterwards because they won't be able to enjoy it. But this story imagines what happens to all of the children from Omelas who are neglected and abused afterwards. What about when they're no longer children? They become adults, they age out of the system in a sense. And it imagines that they all go and they live in a house by the sea. And it's actually super beautiful. I happened to read this story before I read The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, and it just happened to be that I read both of these in the same month. But I really found it moving, and I loved the idea of creating a space and a future for people to deal with whatever abuse they have and trauma that they are dealing with, and not say that they have no meaning in life because of that. Another one that I thought was really fascinating was Disconnect by Fran Wilde. And in this, the main character is a researcher and a professor, and she has, it's sort of like a fantastical science fiction, where she has a disability where her joints and parts of her body will go wandering off into the far reaches of space while she's asleep. So she falls asleep and maybe her toe bone will go off and hang around by Jupiter. And she has this way of kind of singing the body parts back to her. And it's very fantastical, but at the same time, it really is rooted in practicality because a lot of this story is about the day-to-day. It's about how this person has teaching gigs at various different colleges and how, sometimes one of her body parts that she really needs, like a hip or a knee, goes missing and she has to take public transportation, and how riding something like the train is too much movement and it makes her body parts want to fly off. And it's that everyday lived experience of dealing with a disability that is in such interesting juxtaposition with this fantastical science fiction idea of bone pieces going missing into space and grabbing them again. And I loved that story. I really thought that was strong. Another one that I thought was really strong was By Degrees and Dilatory Time by S.L. Huang, which was just very slow and beautiful. And it was about someone who loses their eye to a disease and instead has to get a mechanical eye, and trying to, or eyes, and trying to adapt and accept and deal with this difference. And it was a very slow process of accepting and dealing with and kind of acknowledging what was lost, also what is gained. And I thought that was a really beautiful story. I also wanted to mention two of the poems that were included. There were quite a few poems, but two of them in particular I thought were really interesting for their rejection of the idea of fixing a disability. So the first was Corps de Bricourt by Rose Lemberg, and the second was You Wanted Me to Fly by Julia Watts Belser. Both of these poems bring up this idea of people finding their disability somehow unsightly or needing of smoothing or prettifying or fixing in some way, and both of them sort of reject that idea and say, this makes me who I am, and this is the beauty of creation and diversity and difference, and you want to erase that, but I want it to stay. And I thought that those were both really pretty poems. Next, I wanted to talk about a few of the nonfiction essays that I thought made some really great points and offered a lot of insight into disability representation in science fiction. So the first is Design a Spaceship by Andi C. Buchanan, and this makes some really strong points. So the main premise of this is that disability is not something that is based solely on a person's impairment, but rather is the interaction between a person's impairment and the environment that they're in. And so, for example, if you think about it, almost everybody has something that could be a disability in certain circumstances. So for me, I'm allergic to peanuts. And in the US, that's not really a big deal because almost all food labels will say what they have in it. They'll even call out if something has peanuts in it. If I go to any restaurant, I can say, hey, I'm allergic to peanuts, and they'll make sure that that doesn't come in contact with my food. But there are other countries where peanuts are really, really prevalent, and things like peanut oil, which is very undetectable for me, might be used. And since people aren't even aware that it's a thing, if I ask or tell them, they may not know to remove it. So if I were in a different circumstance, that could be very scary. It could be very debilitating, and that maybe I couldn't eat out because the worry would be that I wouldn't be able to be accommodated. And I think that there's so many things like that where it's not just what your body is doing, but it's what the kind of society expects around you, the way that things are designed. And so in this story, in this essay, Buchanan really argues that as we are writing science fiction, as we are creating this idea of what the future is going to look like, we should have access in mind, and we should make sure that we are not disabling people by creating a future where they do not have access. And so he makes some points talking about how, if in our science fiction we can imagine, aliens from other places who maybe live in water instead of air, but they come and they interact with us, if we can imagine ways that they have access, then we can imagine ways that our spaceships would be designed for people with disabilities. So things like, let's have ramps and elevators, not just stairs. Let's have things where there are abilities for people who have no sight or who don't have hearing to deal with what's going on. And he makes some really strong arguments that we should be designing a future that allows access. Another essay that I thought was really strong was The Expendable Disabled Heroes of Marvel's Infinity War by John Wiswell. And this takes a look at the Marvel universe, the cinematic universe, and says, how are disabled characters represented? How are they used in this story? And really notes that the disability rep isn't so great, in that there are some disabled characters, but often the disabled characters, either they are the bad guys, or they serve just as something to move the plot forward, or they serve simply as a motivation for the hero, or if it's a hero that's disabled, they get over it. And that all of these representations are really faulty. And that disabled people deserve to be heroes. They deserve to not just fall into the background or be a plot device or be used by, the main character's story arc. Another one that is very similar was Give Me Heroism or Give Me Death by Gemma Noon. And in this, Noon really argues that often we see heroes as the ones who are able to withstand their pain, overcome their disability, push through whatever is holding them back, and be strong enough. And Noon argues that that makes it seem like people who aren't able to do those things, who aren't able to somehow learn how to walk again when they've been paralyzed, or who can't just get up and do things when they're dealing with chronic pain, as if they're too weak and they can't be heroes. And that's really disempowering. Another one is The Future is Not Disabled by Marijke Nijkamp. And this one is very interesting because in this, Nijkamp argues that we imagine science fiction, we imagine the future where science will cure all disabilities, where we just won't have disabilities because everything is cured. And Nijkamp, again, kind of bringing it back to what Buchanan was arguing before, talks about how the idea of disability is a social construct, and how when you're imagining this future where disabilities don't exist, how far does that go? And the further you go with this, the further it looks like eugenics, where you're trying to completely eradicate the Ubermensch people, where you're trying to say some bodies and some abilities are acceptable and some aren't. And she argues that instead of trying to cure everybody's disabilities in our future, we should simply build futures where people can be disabled, where it is accessible, where they are part of the stories. There were also a number of personal essays that were included in this collection that talked about the author's relationship with science fiction and how they saw themselves represented in science fiction, as well as where they wanted science fiction to go in the future to represent them better. I thought a lot of these essays were really, really strong. In particular, I liked The Stories We Find Ourselves In by A.T. Greenblatt, which talked about how when we see disabled people in science fiction, they should be able to just exist as disabled. We shouldn't necessarily have them always trying to overcome their disability. Greenblatt deals with cerebral palsy, which is something where, if you spend hundreds of hours in rehab, you might be able to gain a little bit of extra mobility, a little bit of extra turning radius, these sorts of things. But questions, is that the best use of your time? Or is it better to spend your time doing other things and not just focusing on fixing your disability? And maybe we should have that in our science fiction as well, where disabled characters just get to exist and be heroes. Another one was Instant to Motion and Respectability by Bogi Tagaks. And this talks about the intersection of marginalizations and how often being disabled is sort of the lowest rung on the marginalization kind of ladder, where being queer or being of a different race or religion, these sorts of things are afforded a lot more status, whereas when you say that you're disabled, often your voice is discounted. You're considered, you're not able to contribute, you're not really fully capable, and how demoralizing being ignored and being silenced like that is. Another one was Unlocking the Garrett by Rachel Swirsky. This one I really, really loved. It spoke to me, and I don't deal with any disabilities, but I loved what the message was. So basically in this, Swirsky talks about how there's so much advice that's given to writers, given to authors, saying, you need to write every day, and you need to go out there and, promote your books, and you need to do this and that and that. And Swirsky talks about hey, whoa, hold up. Not all of us are able to do these things, and that's okay. It doesn't make you not an author if you need to take a day off, if you have some sort of flare-up of your disability and you need to take the time to care for yourself. And not every one of us is able to go and socialize and put themselves out there in that way. And it's okay to just focus on your writing. That's also a good use of your time. You don't have to feel like, you're not a real author if you're not able to do those things. And just really kind of pushes the idea that it's okay to be gentle and kind with yourself and accept kind of what your limitations are and what your needs are, and not feel like somehow you're too weak or unworthy or not good enough because of those differences. So I found that really a great essay. And another one was Dancing in Iron Shoes by Nicolette Berestov. This one talks about how in stories, sometimes what happens is when there is disabled rep, when there is a disabled character, sometimes authors will portray this disabled character as constantly thinking about their disability, and that's it. Their only concern in life is the fact that their leg doesn't work, or is the fact that they're neurodivergent, or whatever it is. And Bereshov says, hey, most of us, when we have a disability, we've had it for a while, we get used to it, and we go on with our lives. And it's not like every moment we're thinking, wow, I wish my leg worked. We're thinking, man, I really need to get to this place on time. I need to do these things. And just talks about how what would be really nice is for disabled people just to be treated as human, just to be treated as normal people who are doing the things they're doing, and not have the narrative about them so focused on the disability, because that is very othering. And I thought that that was a really insightful comment. There was also a couple of interviews with authors that were done, and I particularly liked one of them with Marissa Lingen, done by Sandra Odell. And in this, Lingen talks about this idea of, again, sort of people who are disabled being disabled because they're bad in some way, because they made bad choices, because they made a mistake, because of something that they did wrong. And how often disabled people will be asked, about how it happened, how they became disabled, what went wrong. And Lingen says, often people want to know this because they want to believe that it is a punishment or it is the consequence of bad choices, when it's not. Disability is just often a chance accident. It's just something that happens and you don't have control over it, and it's not your fault. And the Lingen says maybe the reason why people keep wanting to find a reason and something to blame is because they're afraid it could happen to them. So they want to know what to do to avoid. And that's just very faulty thinking, and it's really problematic when you put disabled people in this category of having deserved what happened to them. And she relates this to the idea of things like sexual harassment and sexual assault, where you should never talk about what the victim did to deserve being assaulted, right? In the same way, you shouldn't talk about what a disabled person did to deserve or bring upon themselves their disability. So overall, there were just a ton of really, really powerful personal stories that were included in this collection. So I hope that gives some insight into why I found this collection to be so strong. It isn't that necessarily every single story or every single essay in this spoke to me, but so many of them did. And even the ones where I didn't necessarily find myself completely drawn in or completely understanding what the author was trying to say, they all had something worthwhile to say. They all had really important perspectives. And what I loved about this collection was how diverse the disabilities were. There were all sorts of representations here, everything from autism to alcoholism to cerebral palsy to being blind or deaf or any of these things. So many different types of experiences, and also very different views. Some of the authors want their chronic pain to go away. Others find that their disability is a part of them and they don't want to give that identity up. That is who they are. And so it was really fascinating to read this wide collection of all of these people who love science fiction and find meaning in it, and what their relationship to science fiction is, what kind of representation they want, and what their experiences are. So I thought that this collection was really, really strong. There are online access links for all of the stories and essays that I have mentioned down in the description box below. So if you're interested in reading any of the stories or essays that I talked about, you can just go and read that online, or you can buy the whole issue if you're interested in that. I really did love this collection. I thought it was very, very strong, and I highly recommend you at least check out one or two of the stories and essays that interested you. If you guys have any comments or any thoughts or anything else that you think I should read, I would love to hear what you think, so go ahead and leave me a comment in the box below.